I'm Leo Walder for Kit Guru. It's Threadripper time. We have here the MSI X399 Gaming Pro Carbon AC motherboard. The name, it's a mouthful, it's also descriptive. It also throws up one of the question marks I have over this motherboard. I've got 2 or 3 of those actually. So X399 straightforward AMD X399 chipset for Threadripper. The processor happens to be the 1950X full fat 16 core big boy processor. Gaming, that's my question. Do gamers use Threadripper? Obviously, if money is no object, you're going to hurl cash into a PC. It's going to be future-proof. Why not? But back in the real world, when you're not paying £300 plus for a motherboard and £1,000 for a processor, do you go for a multi-core Threadripper or do you go for a quad-core or 6-core Kaby Lake stroke Coffee Lake? After all, that's what gamers typically go for. Or if you're going for the cheaper version, Ryzen 5 or 7. Moving on through the name, so gaming. Pro Carbon, we've seen various carbons from MSI, that's known, and there are some carbon look parts. And then AC, we've got a Wi-Fi card here, is Intel AC, 2 antennae, so that makes perfect sense. But you can't see much from over there. Come closer, take a closer look. So here we are, moved in a bit closer. The GTX 1080 Ti graphics card is out of the way and you can see considerably more of the board. Over here we've got the Intel add-in card for the 8211 AC Wi-Fi. Along here we've got the SATA and such like. We'll come to those when we do a around the board shot. We've got our G-Skill Flare X memory, obviously quad channel. There we have a PCI Express graphics connector to give extra juice in case you have a particularly thirsty graphics card. Up the top we have 2 8-pin EPS connectors. I'm not best pleased by the fact they are next to each other. It means of course they're feeding into this side of the CPU socket were they to be either side, or even frankly either end of the top of the board. That would be more satisfactory. Having them right over there, it just doesn't seem right. Main power connector is obviously here. Our fractal design Celsius S24 liquid cooler fan connector is going over here. This is for both the pump and the 2 fans, which is why the Uefi doesn't quite understand what it's doing, because it's seeing the pump and as the fan speed, so it's reporting 2000 RPM. Such is life. You will note that the VRM cooler here is very close to the 2 water block threads here. It doesn't matter whether you're using an Ace-Tech, an air cooler or an aftermarket custom loop. Those 2 screws are going to be in the same position each time, close. Perfectly doable, not the end of the world, but more of a screwdriver job rather than fingers and thumbs. And the thing is, if you have an EKWB block, they are actually thumb screws, so it's a little bit fiddly getting in there, but not the end of the world. Here we have 3 M.2 slots. Exactly as you'd expect. Out comes the screw, and you kind of have to fiddle it away from these sort of little things here. You've got some protective plastic over the slot, obviously as shipped, and reveals the kind of carbon-y finish. And inside the cover we've got a thermal pad, so if you put an M.2 in there, that's fine. Common sense says that it is covered by the graphics card, which doesn't seem like the absolutely ideal thing. So even though it's the topmost slot, that is probably the prime slot to use. So moving around to the foot of the board, we've got all the usual headers and such like for USB and audio and so on and so forth. Nothing to report there, except here we have a USB 3.1 Gen 2 header, power and reset buttons, postcode, and that is the Game Boost knob. That's the hardware overclocking tool. So you literally, once it's enabled, you actually click it around, going all the way up to, yes, 11. You get a lot with this motherboard, but let's start with the cosmetics. So we've got these 3 carbony panels here, and MSI includes alternate panels or alternative panels that you literally pop these out and replace with. So gold or silver. And the thing is, I'm not absolutely sure I like the look of fake carbon fibre, but I think I prefer it to the gold and the silver options. In fact, the gold I don't like at all. The silver I could live with, but the stock carbon-y look things, yep, fair enough. It's called carbon, it looks carbon, let's go with carbon. The M.2 shields are, well, I mean, it's like carbon fibre printed on the steel, and it's a little bit tacky, frankly. We've got the two 8-pin EPSs, not happy about the fact they're together as mentioned before, but you do get them. You've got the 6-pin for the graphics card, you've got your VRM cooler there, obviously the enormous Threadripper socket, 8 DDR4 DIMMs. That takes up half the board. The bottom half, you've got 4 PCI Express times 16 slots. It is worth spelling out, they are not going to run all at times 16. Typically you'd expect them to run times 16 times 8 times 16 times 8. Because obviously if you use all 4 slots at times 16, that is all the PCI Express, the Threadripper gone right there. And you don't actually need realistically more than times 8 for a graphics card. Crossfire and SLI both supported. We've got 8 SATA 3s here, so 6 laid down to there. And we've got a pair of USB 3 headers also laid down. So those are USB 3.1 Gen 1 in modern parlance, to my mind USB 3.0s. That is a USB 3.1 Gen 2, which would typically go to a Type-C connector, provided your case or some peripheral device supports that. And we've got a couple of old school USB 2.0s. Front panel headers. We've got a total of 4 fan headers, 3 bunched together here, 1 up top for CPU. We've also got a pump connector, which is higher power. I think that can supply 15 watts from memory. There's also LED connectors down the bottom if you want to go for the full bling lighting effect inside your case. You'll notice we've also got little bits of wiring to do with the RGB that's on board. Turning to the I/O, we've got 2 USB 2.0s. These red connectors are actually USB 3s. They haven't gone for the usual blue style. So those 8 are USB 3.0s, although they call them USB 3.1 Gen 1. That is a USB 3.1 Gen 2, and that is USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C. We've got Intel Gigabit Ethernet, which is appropriate in that it matches the Intel AC Wi-Fi, but seems a bit peculiar on an AMD board. And then we've got a whole bunch of audio, 7.1 channel SPDIF included. Time for a quick tour around the Uefi. So mouse control works perfectly well, mouse moves nice and smoothly. We've got hardware mode enabled for the Game Boost control knob, and it's currently set on position 6 there. If I just turn the dial off screen, you can see I'm clicking up through the settings. However, you get no clue what those settings actually do unless you save and restart and then go back in the Uefi, which is a bit of a bore. XMP is enabled, Profile 2 puts the memory at 3200 MHz, which is the full speed. And you'll note if I click down to Profile 1, it doesn't actually tell you what's going on until you save and restart. So that's a bit boring. If I turn hardware mode off on the Game Boost control, so now in software, we're now allowing the Uefi to do its thing. So we've got all the usual settings here, as you'd expect to see. Nothing surprising there, although it does get a little laggy now when moving around. Go back, boot, security says that's all usual. In the OC settings, we've got a bunch of good things. Normal or expert mode for overclocking. Although I have to say the difference between normal and expert is, well, actually tricky to see. Because here we are in expert mode. Step back to normal mode. And to my eyes, it don't look a whole lot different. There you can see the XMP Profile 2 is enabled, taking to 3200 MHz. If we change that to Profile 1, you can see it's 3066. So the clunky button up here doesn't show you exactly what's going on, but when you dive into the Uefi proper, you can indeed see what's occurring. So we've got all the usual voltage controls, the autos. You can either punch in a number or toggle up and down. So going plus 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 or 1.4 works perfectly well. Going back to auto mode, you have to go down to the bottom of the queue, and certainly in some of the settings it will kind of skip past. You have to go all around again, having worked out where the bottom is. There we go, that's the bottom. I'm sure if I hit minus again, I'll get back up to the top of the tree, which is unsafe overvolting territory. So we're running at 1.3 volts on this hardware overclocking mode at the moment, which is slightly less than you expect. The maximum voltage was a tad over 1.4 with the maximum overclocking mode, which took it to just over 4 gigahertz, although it wasn't stable, so that wasn't a lot of help. M-Flash, plug in the USB drive, it then reads the drive, automatically reboots and takes you through a flashing process, which is just automated. It just does it for you. When I was trying to figure out one of the features of this board, the Mystic Lighting, I wasn't the least bit clear if it's working or not. It was actually the software rather than the BIOS. I used the M-Flash process to go from BIOS 1.50 up to the current 1.62. I then went back to 1.50 just to see whether or not the problem I was having with Mystic Lighting was anything to do with the BIOS. It was actually to do with me understanding the software, and then I was able to go from 1.5 back up to 1.62 again. So the board is entirely happy to go to any BIOS version that is legitimate for this motherboard. No problem whatsoever. Hardware monitor is actually fairly nifty. You do have to tell it whether the fans are PWM or DC mode. It's not like the smart fan mode on Gigabyte, where it will just sort it out for you. Also, you have to decide which you're going to use as your temperature monitor, CPU or system. That's entirely fair. It's been suggested in the past on KitGuru, blue and handy if you could actually monitor the GPU as well. System temperature isn't really likely to be a problem, but there are very often the case that the GPU will actually run hotter than the CPU, and you might want to bump up the fan speeds to move air around to keep the GPU cool. But such is life. Here we have a live graph going on, and there we can see our CPU sitting at our fan sitting at a rock steady 2000. I'm actually inclined to think that is not the fan speed, because the fans are actually running much slower than that. That is actually the pump off the Acetec liquid cooler, the Fractal Design S24. And the other fans, as you can see, are doing Nout at the moment. I've moved the temperature figures around in the smart fan mode. You can literally move them up like so to get it to do whatever you like. You can't drag it below the previous point, which is sensible. But custom curve, easy peasy, 4 points along the way, no problem whatsoever. And down here we've got a readout of voltages. So that's all good stuff. And then the Board Explorer is a visual representation of what's going on, and we can agree this is indeed this board. So that's the I/O panel. If we move around the foot of the board, we can see these fan headers are disconnected. This is quite correct. The only fan header in use is the one up here, which has the Acetec cooler connected. It thinks that's running at 2000 RPM, but that's the pump rather than the fans. But as to how much information you're actually gleaning from this, beyond what your eyes can tell you, I'm not entirely sure. Nonetheless, it's useful, it works, it's accurate, and it is certainly this motherboard rather than something generic. So that's all to the good. Mystic Light is the control software for the LEDs that are scattered all over this motherboard, and it does a reasonable job once you figure out how on earth it works. So you have to drag, in this instance, the motherboard icon into the timeline over here, device setting, then you click on setting, and then it takes you to this other panel where you can start adjusting things. Once you get to this stage, it's all fairly straightforward. So we've selected all to link all the various parts of the motherboard together. At the moment it's doing a breathing thing in red, and the lights all over the board are behaving themselves as you'd expect. If we change that to pink for argument's sake and click on apply, we've now got pink lighting going on, which actually I can see from this angle is sort of a combination of blue and pink to give you kind of mauve, but never mind that, that's a mere detail. And you can see all the areas of the board that are working away in unison. So as it's breathing, they're fading on and off. If we change the breathing to flashing, basically the same, just faster. Perfectly straightforward, entirely reasonable, and you get all the usual marquees and such like, just as you'd expect. So that's basically chasing itself around the board, and so on and so forth. All the RGB stuff that we're used to. However, that control software, really not the greatest. Also, it's quite surprising seeing the user interface full screen pretty much. I mean, this is a 4K panel. It's 28 inches. Why on earth is it so large? It's really strange to see. and you notice if I mouse over this way, there's no sort of option to drag it in and reduce it down. It's huge. But anyway, the software does work, but it's not great. Two pieces of software that are very useful. The first is MSI Live Update, currently on version 6. So you install the software and it then crunches through the system, checking for drivers, software and BIOS versions and telling you what you need to update. As I'm reviewing this motherboard, as you'd expect, everything is up to date. There's a bunch of apps I have not installed and the Ethernet drivers are not up to date, but then I'm not using Ethernet, so that's no problem whatsoever. This software is particularly useful when you first build the system. Basically, get yourself online, install Live Update, and let it sort itself out. Very handy. And then we have MSI Command Center, which is on version 3. 3.0.0.40 to be pedantic about it. This is telling you what the CPU and such like are currently doing. So you can see probably that I've overclocked to 3.9 gigahertz, so it's times 39, base clock is 100, which is obviously faster than stock speed. The thing here that's interesting, if we go through, so DRAM is running at XMP voltage and speed. The IGP doesn't apply as it's Threadripper. Game boost. This is useful because that game boost control knob on the board, although you can see in the BIOS what the game boost is actually doing, the speed table here is not laid out anywhere else that I've found. I haven't found it in the manual, I haven't found it actually on MSI's website, and I certainly didn't see it in the Uefi. So that table of speeds for 1920X, 1900X and 1950X, very useful. That tells you what speeds you're aiming for, and you can sort of choose from there which is the likeliest speed to attempt. I'm actually somewhere around the mid-range of my 3.9 gigahertz. So that's the MSI X399 Gaming Pro Carbon AC. You can overclock with it, you can do everything you want to do, play games and such like, but it is a slightly curious motherboard. It's got a load of RGB, the Mystic lighting, it works, but you have to kind of get to grips with the software and you are pretty much on your own because the GUI and the instructions are really not a lot of help. But once you figure it out, it's fine. So, okay. Not exactly a cross against that, but not much of a tick either. It's a feature, but it could do with some help. That software is not the greatest. Overclocking, really strange to find you can't just dive in the BIOS, crank up the voltage, whack up the multiplier and let the thing dance away. It doesn't want to do it. Use the game boost control knob on the other hand, absolutely fine. I mean, the overclocking is not quite as good as other models that we've seen, but it's close enough. In terms of the ultimate overclocking Threadripper motherboard, in my mind, this is not that motherboard. But it does do a reasonable job, and it's really hard to complain about the fraction of a percentage of a difference in performance. I'm not going to lose much sleep over that. I do have to wonder whether the two EPS connectors at the top of the board powering the CPU, the fact they're completely together rather than either side of the CPU socket, I have to wonder if that's a factor. And that's kind of my takeaway impression of this motherboard, which is it's perfectly fine. It works properly. It is sound. But I'm not personally convinced that this is a gaming product. Threadripper can clearly do anything that you ask of it. It's got a massive amount of potential for gaming, for regular use, for video editing, for workstations, all sorts of things. You can clearly game and stream simultaneously, no problem whatsoever. Nonetheless, to call it a gaming board, I don't know. It just seems in my mind's eye that it should be more of the emphasis on the pro rather than the gaming. Having said that, both those words are in the title, so what the heck? Perhaps it's the fact I'm seeing gaming ahead of pro. It could be as simple as that. So there we have that. The carbony part, well, yeah, okay, but then if you clip on those silver or gold accessories instead of the carbony bits, it becomes the Gaming Pro Silver AC. It's just a name, it means nothing, and yet there's that kind of impression of the fake plasticky carbony thing. I'm not a massive fan of that. But those are really trivial complaints. In terms of performance, the huge amount of I/O, the features, the really good AC Wi-Fi card, the pricing, you can't complain about that. It is bang in the mid-range along with a bunch of other boards. It's absolutely a contender. It's a good motherboard. It's just not the pick of the bunch. A solid contender, however, no two ways about it. If you like this video, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. If you want more from Kit Guru, click to subscribe. I'm Leo Warder for Kit Guru. This is the MSI X399 Gaming Pro Carbon AC.